Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation podcast, where we discuss the exciting innovations that lie ahead for organizational ground transportation. Each episode, we cover topics tailored to those resolving transportation-related challenges and provide tips, tools, and trends that will inspire you to stay ahead of the curve. And now, here's your host, Daniel Perez.
Welcome to the Future of Ground Transportation. Today we have a special guest, Alisha Giglio, with the climate change expert at Sinai. Alisha, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Hi, Danielle. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thank you for being part of this episode today. So today we're going to be speaking about Sinai and sort of the technology and sort of innovation approach that Sinai brings into the industry and different many industries into the environmental sector, especially with your title as a climate change expert. So excited to dive deeper into this conversation. With that being said, Alisha, just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get started in your industry?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a chemical engineer by training. I have both an undergrad and a master's degree in chemical engineering, actually. And so now I'm a climate change expert at Sinai, but I followed a little bit of a convoluted path to get here. So my first job at a university was at an engineering consulting firm. I was doing a lot of like engineering design work, mainly in the mining and metal space, but for a lot of companies in that like heavy industrial sector. And when you're in consulting, you kind of get thrown into everything. So I did a climate change project for a big mining company actually really early on in my career. And then from that point on, I was kind of the climate change expert in mining for my company. And so when I was at the consulting company, we formed a climate change practice. I was a part of that, and we grew the team from I think there was 2 or 3 of us to about 15 people. And over about 3 years, I worked on a lot of decarbonization strategy projects for Fortune 500 companies all over the world. I also did some really cool engineering design work and things like carbon capture and hydrogen electrolyzers. And so during that time in my consulting firm, I met Maria, who is the CEO of Sinai Technologies. And so she was building software that basically kind of replaced consultants in a way and really kind of put the ownership on the end users for carbon accounting and decarbonization strategy. And her approach was very aligned to really how I approached the work when I was in consulting. So I ended up jumping over to Sinai as a climate change expert. So now I'm a climate change expert at Sinai. What that means is kind of really depends on the week. So some weeks I'm super involved in product development for releasing new features, and the engineers and designers need some support. Other weeks I'm on a bunch of sales calls. Other weeks I'm helping our customer support teams onboard clients. So yeah, really depends on what's going on in business.
Perfect. So help us understand, for all the listeners, especially for transit agencies, entrepreneurs that own trucking companies, bus companies, what is sort of the solution that you guys are offering into this sort of different industries?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sinai, basically we're a SaaS platform. So we've got pre-built software modules for companies really across every sector. But some of our sweet spots are the heavy emitting sectors. So exactly like you said, transportation, other companies like oil and gas or cement or mining we also work with. But we have different modules that really help clients through what we call all parts of the decarbonization journey. So usually companies are starting with carbon accounting. So they're trying to understand what are their emissions for their operations. I don't want to get into too much details, but things like scope 1, 2, and 3. And then some companies are more advanced. So they're thinking about, how can I reduce the emissions? What projects can I implement? What should my targets be to reduce those emissions? And how much is that going to cost my business? So we kind of do everything from starting out, what does my profile look like, to what can I do in the future throughout these 5 different modules. Yeah.
Thank you, Alisha. So I'll go back into the bus sector. Let's just say we start with the bus sector. if you have a company or a transit agency that currently owns 500 buses,
Mhm.
is there a way to sort of identify what is the current emissions and how can you reduce the emission
Mhm.
expenditures, I would say.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you could just walk us a little bit through that journey, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, it really depends where a client is, but whether you have, data on maybe liters of gasoline or diesel you consume, that's probably, the best data to start with. And we would recommend our clients are starting with understanding what the emissions are for their operations. Um, some of our clients, it might be tougher to get that type of information. So maybe you don't have, the liters of diesel consumed, but you know how many kilometers are driven. So we can use that information to really, understand again what the emissions profile of the company is. Maybe even that information is hard to gather. So sometimes we'll work with companies and just say, okay, well, how much are you spending on fuel? And you can determine the emissions that way. So those are kind of like the first steps to just understanding a company's profile. And then we're working with companies who are also interested in the decarbonization space. So maybe a company comes to Sinai and says, okay, we now have understand our emissions, but what do we do to reduce them? So we can work with them to like in the software, we'll model projects. So maybe, exactly. Yeah. Or like maybe you've chatted with the provider of an electric bus. And so if you purchase that bus, for example, what impact would that make on your emissions? If you purchase one bus, is that going to reduce your total, annual emissions by 5%? Is that going to reduce your emissions by 10%? We can help companies look at things like what are the emissions from your diesel fleet versus and a battery electric fleet, considering, the emission factor of their grid that they're on. How much is that going to cost? So maybe, those providers are giving you cost estimates now. Maybe you have an idea of how much that's going to cost 5 years from now. So it's kind of like this intertwining your like environmental modeling with like some business strategy and financial decisions.
Got it. And Alicia, typically the ideal customer, like what is the main objective? Is it just reducing emissions overall for the environment? Is it more from a compliance perspective?
Hmm. Yeah. So right now there is a lot of changes happening in terms of compliance, depending where you are in the world. So in the US, companies do have to report their scope 1, 2 emissions above a certain threshold. There's lots of talks on including scope 3 in that, or whether that threshold is going to change. That being said, a lot of companies who aren't required to report are interested in understanding their emissions so they can, project to the market that they're doing something to reduce. So I would say that is the primary goal, is to kind of first, make sure you're adhering to the local regulatory environment. And then second, it's almost like a mechanism to show your consumers that, you're doing something. And so kind of a lot of companies, I would say, are approaching it from both angles.
Got it. Great said, Alicia. So is it projections or is it actually actuals emissions that you guys are calculating? So for example, when you go into a company like us with 100 vehicles, with your current infrastructure, are you sort of creating a projection per quarter, per day, based on the mileage and vehicles that we have? So is it actually projections of what's happening and how you're reducing it, or is it actual, or are you actually identifying the actual emission expenditure? Let's just say.
Yeah, so we do both. I would say the first module that we're looking at is primarily historic looking. So we're taking that actual kilometers driven, if you guys have those records, or actual diesel consumed, to see, in 2022, what was, for example, the DPV emissions profile. What we can also do is take some of that historic data and see how your operations are being forecasted into the future to estimate what those emissions are going to be in 2023 and 2024 if you don't do anything. And then over that, we can almost overlay, if you purchase half your fleet as electric buses, then in, say, 2025, what are the emissions going to decrease down to? So it's kind of a combination of everything to get the whole business perspective. Yeah.
Got it. How is the electrical vehicle space sort of helping or affecting what Sinai does?
Yeah. I mean, for us, it's definitely a really good opportunity that some of our clients are looking at to consider decarbonization. Um, the US, especially in particular, and other countries have goals around like completely decarbonizing the grid. So the US is planning on a complete decarbonization by 2035. So that being said, what that means is if you replace your entire fleet with electric buses by 2035, you can presume that you're going to be basically a net zero company. So you're not going to have any emissions from your operations. Obviously, there's other considerations in that transition as, where are all these electric buses coming from? How are we charging them? Making sure there's, the grid infrastructure there, as well as all the charging stations that are available. But it's definitely something that obviously a lot of clients are looking at. And even just understanding, maybe it doesn't make sense to change your whole fleet today, but what is the forecast of availability of electric fleets into the future? What are those future costs? How are they going to compare to our traditional diesel engines? And then usually companies are taking that for an understanding of when does it make sense for us to actually transition our fleet. So maybe we'll do 20% of it by 2025, and we'll plan to do 50% of it by 2030. And so by having kind of an understanding of what, the future outlook is of some of our decarbonization technologies, companies can really start planning for the future.
Got it. Thank you, Alicia. We say that most of the companies and entrepreneurs that are working with Sinai, is it mainly that they're working with Fortune 1000 companies and they sort of looking to comply with companies that are moving more into sort of whether it's electrical vehicles or just environmental free?
I wouldn't say it's just compliance. I mean, some companies are definitely using this as an opportunity to set themselves apart from their peers. And I mean, working in software, I say software is, the place to make these like business almost mistakes. So like, you can use our software and model everything. We encourage our customers to model your electric buses, model a hydrogen bus, model crazy biofuel projects just to see how that's going to impact, your environmental emissions, and then also to understand what the financial impacts are going to be to your business. So, for example, you're going to get great reductions with a hydrogen bus. It might be very expensive. We understand it might be very hard to actually obtain those vehicles, but you can kind of compare and contrast the different opportunities in software. And so really, we're just a place for companies to plan all these projects, understand what they mean, share them, internally with their C-suite audience, with their peers, with the operations people. And then you can kind of make a decision and actually go purchase, that physical entity once you understand what that means for the business.
God, thank you, Alicia. Very well said. And what do you see sort of Sinai in 3 to 5 years, especially with whether it's electrical vehicles, autonomous vehicles, flying cars? Where's Sinai going to be playing the game the next 5 to 10 years with all these different components coming ahead of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're really trying to be that one-stop shop for companies in the space to come to Sinai and understand everything environmental about their business. So, understand their emissions profile, and then also understand what are all the different projects and opportunities that you could deploy within your operations. So I think a space that, eventually we want to get to, let's say, far into the future, but maybe, we are able to connect people like DPV with different suppliers and establish, that relationship so you guys can really understand how that impacts your business. Obviously, we're a software company. We're not actually able to provide the physical units or entities, but as much as we can connect these companies that are responsible for the emissions and want to do something about it with those technology providers. I think we're helping everybody make a difference in the decarbonization space. So that's definitely where we're trying to get to.
Awesome. Any sort of concerns or challenges that you sort of foresee, in the next 2 or 3 years as you guys sort of continue to focus on reducing emissions?
I think the biggest thing as a company in this space is it's always changing. The landscape's always changing in terms of like the regulatory requirements inside like the US with SEC regulations, but even globally. I've been in the space for a number of years, and every year there's new regulations, there's new requirements for reporting, and there's even new technologies. So what a company maybe decides they want to do today, for their, let's call it their bus fleet, might look very different in 5 or 10 years from now as new technologies get released to the market. So I think for us, we're just trying to stay agile, trying to make sure that we're helping companies, meet their regulatory requirements, but also be a place where companies can always come back to when they need to reiterate on their environmental strategy, because we expect that's going to continue to happen over the next few years.
Got it. Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, Alisha, because especially with so many different variables happening in the industry, in different industries, especially in this space, how can companies like really stand out from the crowd, as we mentioned from the beginning, whether it's like really showing, whether it's Fortune 1000 or just overall our population, how we sort of helping with the environment. And so I'm sure that that's going to be critical for you guys.
Yeah.
And in regards to switching a little bit of the subject, so what is the best business advice you ever gotten, personal or professionally?
Yeah, I think the best advice that I think I got this actually as I was transitioning my job from consulting to the tech space, was like the worst thing that can happen is nothing. So like the worst thing is the status quo. Bad things aren't the worst thing that can happen to us. There's always a learning curve through everything. So if we do nothing, then there's no learning. And yeah, I think doing something outside your comfort zone will generally result in positive learnings or change. So I've definitely tried to integrate that into all the decisions that I make on a day-to-day.
Totally. And what is the best business book that you would recommend, Alisha, whether it's in the industry or outside of the industry?
Yeah, I'll definitely say some in the industry for the listeners. So one that I read recently was Speed and Scale. So it's an action plan for solving the climate crisis now. And it's really good for anybody just trying to understand the global economic climate change landscape. It's by John Doerr. So he was the one that almost made like the OKR mainstream. And so the book basically describes what we need to do to reduce electricity emissions. What do we need to do to reduce emissions in the transportation sector? And it's really cool because he hits like these key targets for getting down to net zero. So that's definitely one that I would say is really good for somebody new to the space. Another one actually that I'll say that a colleague recommended to me. So I actually haven't read it, but it's called Green Giants, How Smart Companies Turn Sustainability into a billion-dollar Business. So it's basically how companies can think about leveraging like the whole environmental and sustainability movement for their business. So I've heard that's a good one, but it is on my list of my next book to read.
Perfect. All right. So for all the listeners that are listening to this episode today, especially if you're looking for a climate change expert, definitely reach out to Alisha with Sinai. We will be posting in the episode notes all the information about Alisha. How can the listeners get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is sinai.com, SINAI. My email is alisha@sinai.com, or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. And we will make sure to provide those LinkedIn notes as well. Again, Alisha, it's been a pleasure having you on the show tonight. We really appreciate it. For the folks that are looking to implement, again, a sort of climate change expert with all these different components of saving emissions and really improving your current infrastructure, please reach out to Alisha. And then at the same time, if you have any ground transportation needs surrounding transportation and also reducing carbon footprint, please reach out. Stay in touch with us. Please make sure you like and subscribe for our next episode. All right. With that being said, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Future of Ground Transportation. We appreciate you coming along for the ride. If you found value in this episode and want to hear more, please make sure to subscribe to the show.